Thanks for coming. Today I'm going to talk to you about systematic reviews. The first part of the presentation will be about how I went about my systematic review, and then the second half will be about the findings. I'm currently coming towards the end of my third year of my part-time PhD at CRELLA, and my study is it's a workplace-based study that I'm carrying out a Cambridge assessment. Before I get to the literature review part, I need to share my research questions with you. I'm interested in the decision-making process during standard setting and what factors and resources affect the decision-making of the panelists, the domain and content experts who make up the standard setting panel. That's research question 1. And in research question 2, I'm wondering if there's a common sequence in which they attend to these factors and resources. In question 3, you can see I'm looking at two different groups of standard setters, those who are consistent and those who are less consistent. I wonder if there are any differences in the decision making of those two groups. Question 4 is there because the aim of my study is to improve operational practice. For the presentation today, in terms of the literature review, I'm really focusing on the first two questions. I'm looking for information about decision making as a process, as a concept, what factors and resources affect decision making. And the setting I'm interested in is where you have content and domain experts working together. So in summary, I'm looking at individual decision making of experts who are working in some kind of collective high stakes environment. The first stage of a systematic review is to carry out an initial screening of the literature. And to do this, I used search criteria which included alignment, assessment, language, judge, panel, expert, standard setting, cut score, and then I filtered that by decision making. I limited myself to peer-reviewed articles and a time range from 2001, and I further limited my search by subject type, so only looking at standard setting, language testing, ESL and second language learning, and by discipline, language and linguistics. And that resulted in a collection of 62 standard setting sources. In the standard setting literature I found there are very few standard setting studies out there that talk about decision making. As you can see on the slide, it's only 12 out of the 62 that I found were looking at judgments. The others were looking at were just sort of procedural or technical reports, or they were discussing why one standard setting method might be better than another. And there I found 4 that were looking at standard setting in remote settings, which is also the scenario for my study. This meant that I would need to move beyond the standard setting literature to find out more about decision making, and I needed to do a systematic review in order to get there. You might be wondering if you're doing a systematic review. Well, first of all, there's no such thing as a systematic review. There are systematic approaches and types of systematic review, just as there are traditional approaches to the literature. In a systematic approach, you need to have questions that are specific and they inform your search strategy. In a systematic review, you decide on your search strategy. So, for example, in my initial screening of the literature, I mentioned on the previous slide some of the keywords that I searched for. That's part of my search strategy. In addition to your the words that you use in your electronic searching of databases, you also need to have inclusion and exclusion criteria to help you filter out the literature. The reason behind this is that you are supposed to be explicit about your search strategy so that other researchers in future can update your findings by carrying out the same search, but perhaps with a different time frame, for example. Another key aspect of the systematic review is that you validate your sources. You consider how often the source has been cited, the reliability of the journal that it's published in, and you use qualitative analysis tools such as NVivo or MaxQDA to analyze your sources as if they are a data set. And at the end of the process, you have answers to your specific question or your specific set of questions. I talked about my initial screening of the literature. So the second stage is this systematic search for sources. My inclusion criteria were to look for references to processes, frameworks, or models of decision making. I didn't look at anything earlier than 2001, and I only considered sources that were written in English. My exclusion criteria were sources which compared different types of teams or had settings with limited relevance. I found there were sources that had a focus on race or gender or the financial aspects of decision making. All of these were excluded. In a systematic review, as you carry out your searching, there are 3 things that help you that are part of the method in a systematic review. The first of these is parallel searching. That means following up articles recommended as similar by your search software, such as Google Scholar, or your academic database, might be recommended by the journal. Forward searching means following up citing articles, and backward searching is following up references in the journal, in the bibliographies. As I carried out qualitative review of the sources that had been thrown up by my search criteria, I focused on those which conceptualized intuition as expertise-based decision making, or some kind of expertise was involved in the decision. This is in order to relate my findings to the standard setting context that I'm interested in. Because my study takes place in an operational setting, I also included decision making in natural environments or the workplace, and included studies which involved processing multiple sources of data and working with a group of experts. Here you can see a visual representation of my systematic review. Because there wasn't much out there in decision making in standard setting and language testing, I decided to look at standard setting in other fields. That's in the educational measurement literature. I looked at decision making in other fields, mainly psychology, operational research, studies into decision making of jury members, and decision making in workplace-based settings. I also broadened my search within the assessment field and investigated decision making by item writers, raters, and markers. An additional aspect of the search strategy which I need to mention is that you're supposed to, in a systematic review, look at what is called the grey literature. This is literature in addition to articles published in peer-reviewed journals, so literature produced by other testing organisations in my case. After identifying all your sources, you carry out a qualitative review to decide if they stay in or they don't. If you're interested in the scope of this process, my initial search strategy identified 959 sources, and my current total of studies is 68. After qualitative review, those were the studies that talked about decision making in sufficient detail and addressed, or would help me to address, my research questions. After finalising my database, we now come to stage 3, the organisation and planning of the analysis of the sources. I forgot to say earlier, but the symbol on the slide, the circle with arrows, that's representing this iterative process where you're carrying out your systematic research for sources and you're refining your search criteria, and you might have to do that several times before you're satisfied that it's throwing up what you want in sufficient detail. As I said earlier, a systematic review makes use of qualitative analysis software. I used MathsQDA. I decided on a two-step approach, starting with an initial selection of codes, which could be developed later as I engaged further with the literature, so that I could code for any themes that came out later as I got more familiar with my data set of sources. So I coded for processes, factors, standard setting sources, resources. I coded for the skills that were being tested, the standard setting method that was being used, the name of the exam, theories of decision making. This is because I need to synthesize the literature, so I need to look at who is researching this phenomenon in the same way as me. Are they using the same methods or instruments? Are their aims the same as mine, or are they different? So I coded also for methods, instruments, aims, limitations, and findings. This presentation is mainly about how I went about my systematic review, but obviously you will need to see some of the findings. In the wider literature, I looked at operational research such as fire and police service studies, management and psychology, legal studies. These were all individuals working in collective environments. Their decisions were high stakes. My synthesis of the findings enabled me to make a model of decision making, and I started to build this up as I went through the literature. The decision maker is in the middle. The decision making processes can be conscious and unconscious. Across the wider literature, the internal factors which influence the process are experience and knowledge and expertise. The external factors are the data and evidence they draw on, the resources they pay attention to, and whether or not they are under pressure of time. Looking at the rater and item writing literature, it became clear that it wasn't just knowledge and expertise that was important as an internal factor. It was domain-specific knowledge and expertise. Some of the item writing and rating literature looked at the role of experience, and so they were comparing more experienced and less experienced raters or item writers. What they found was that individual decision-making style or individual preferences had more of an effect on the decision making than the level or the amount of experience. Where experience did play a role was that someone with greater expertise or experience could progress from conscious processing to rapid unconscious processing. I talked about the systematic review being an iterative process, and I found that when I was coding and looking at my results, it was iterative as well, because as I synthesized the literature in the language testing, I would find things that then, if I looked for them in the wider literature, I would find that they were complementary, that they were mentioned there as well. The wider literature also included research into individual decision-making style and mentioned domain-based knowledge and expertise. Something else that came through in the item writing and language testing literature was the role of peer feedback and support, the social aspect of decision making. This linked back to the studies in jury decision making in the wider literature. So I added these factors as I built up my model. This is my most recent model of decision making. As I've been writing up my literature review, what has also come through from the wider literature, the standard setting literature, the item writing and rater literature is the role played by attitudes and beliefs about assessment, and so that's been added as an internal factor. So on the slide, what you can see now is what I've learned from carrying out a systematic review. It takes a while. I started last December 2020 and I'm just wrapping it up now. But I have pretty much written my entire literature review chapter. And in the systematic review literature, it seems that 12 to 18 months is around average for a systematic review. Usually it's carried out by a team of people, so 4 or 5 people working with 2,000 sources, they would expect to take around a month, around 18 months. I'm still learning how to use MaxQDA, but this has stood me in good stead for carrying out my data analysis later on when I have done my data collection. For example, this is something that does save you time. I coded in my sources for interviews and for questionnaires and so on, and I was able to, with a few clicks, find out how many people had used those types of data collection. So it definitely informed my methods section. It gave me a path to follow as well in these new fields I was unfamiliar with, operational psychology research and some aspects of the measurement literature, so that's very helpful. Systematic reviews are set up to synthesize findings, and I think they facilitate criticism. I'm definitely a better writer now than I was before I did this systematic review. I'm more objective, and I've developed my abilities to synthesize and criticize. I can see that very clearly. And I hope you find it useful, and I'm happy to take questions. There are so many sources I could include. I decided to give you a mix of literature review sources, decision-making sources beyond language testing, and some sources that talk about marker decision-making, standard setting decision-making, and rater decision-making.